Hi, everyone. This is Phil Mangieri with Restaurant Research. Today I have on the call with me Chris Wren, who is VP of Business Development and Franchise Strategy for CIT Bank. We're here to discuss the impact of mounting wage pressure on P&Ls in the franchised restaurant space, along with possible remedies. To this end, we incorporate sensitivity analysis to model our key points. Let's start with some background. As we can see from this chart, the hourly wage rate across all industries has increased 10% since 2014, according to government data. And we think it's important to note that the current average exceeds $22 per hour. So it's not surprising that the restaurant hourly wage rate of just $13 an hour, also according to government data, is growing at a faster rate than the hourly wage for the overall economy. In fact, the restaurant hourly wage rate is up 18% since 2014 versus 10% the economy, representing a sizable 8% gap. This has had big impact on labor margins at the store level, which are up roughly 150 basis points over the same period. So we start with the base case P&L in order to model the possibility of an additional 150 basis point hike in labor margin as restaurant hourly wages continue to catch up with the economy's overall average over time. In this simplified underwriting model, we consider a typical QSR unit with a 1.5 million AUV and 4 turns of senior debt. As we can see, a corresponding 1.42 FCCR provides ample cushion compared to the typical 1.25 minimum. Chris, let's start with the base case. How has wage inflation impacted your underwriting process?
It's an interesting time. The U.S. restaurant business has been predicated on labor being abundant and cheap, and neither of those things is as true as it used to be. I don't think, Phil, we've seen a profound change in how we underwrite. There's 2 things we've seen, however. The first thing is a couple of years ago, there probably would have been a lot more enthusiasm to give labor credits in year 1 versus year 0. If somebody was taking over a business, that there was some opportunity to get efficiencies. Our underwriters would have been a little bit more amenable to giving credit on that. I think there's less of a willingness to kind of bet on the upside now, and that's resulting in lower proceeds in some cases. And the other thing is I think there's probably a little bit more caution around certain geographies that have already experienced, substantial impact on the labor price side. California, where I live, for example, and up in the Northeast. I don't think there's been a profound change in terms of how underwriting works, other than maybe being a little bit more tentative, a little bit more cautious, and certainly less willingness to give credit for potential upsides on acquisitions and refis.
Okay, great. Thanks, Chris. How long can operators implement labor mitigation strategies? And do we expect that labor margins will eventually ramp up another 150 basis points like we see on this slide?
I think that we've seen the better operators have been taking steps to be more efficient from a scheduling perspective. Maybe they've invested in technology. And in addition to the labor cost, you've also got the labor availability, scarcity simultaneously, which has also driven costs up. So I think between more efficiency management, maybe a little more capital investment, reduced hours, and then taking some pricing, I think they've been able to control labor margins and minimize the pass-through to the consumer, or at least make them aware of it. But I think that if wages continue to increase in all states, rather than just in some states, they're going to have to take some more substantial steps in order to avoid margin dilution.
You mentioned price increases. On this slide, we show like a 2% price increase, and we're showing that it's really insufficient to deal with wage inflation. Is that kind of like what your perspective is in terms of, pricing as a mitigation?
If everything else was constant, you could get the benefit of most of that. Just given the magnitude of labor inflation that we're seeing, I think it's going to be tough, to cover the full dilution and the full increase in labor margins. So I think pricing will get you part of the way, but not going to get you all of the way for sure.
Okay. On this slide, we show an 8% price increase is what's necessary to offset a 1.5% hike in the labor margins. Pretty unrealistic. I think that's the point.
I think that if, in a normal universe where labor was flat, people would probably be taking 1% to 2% a year just to cover overall inflation. But you add in recent labor inflation over the past couple of years, and if the net action you need to take is 8%, obviously that's not realistic.
And how do you look at the possible strategy of reducing or eliminating CapEx to deal with short-term margin pressure? I know it's a big temptation. It can certainly help free cash flow as we see on this slide.
When I was working on the franchisor side, the conversation about discretionary versus non-discretionary capital investment was an ongoing one, and obviously franchisees and franchisors would have a different perspective. But I mean, I think probably one of the best mitigation strategies to minimize labor scarcity and cost is to invest in labor-saving technologies, whether it's the IT side or whether it's the production side. And obviously, that would result in a net substantial increase in many cases on CapEx. So, I mean, if operators are looking to preserve their margins, which is understandable by reducing CapEx, I think that's a short-sighted strategy. Franchisors need to show more leadership, but also franchisees need to be prepared to invest. And while that might be dilutive in the short term, it's certainly going to pay a dividend in the longer term. So I think that the CapEx is absolutely indispensable.
All right, that's great. In conclusion, it seems to us that it's fair to say that there's no easy fixes to deal with the mounting wage inflation, which is likely here to stay, at least over the medium term. And it seems to us that in the end, this is a hospitality business that requires human touch. While business models are going to have to evolve over time, we think that higher compensated employees may not be such a bad thing, in our opinion anyway, as it will hopefully lead to lower turnover and resultantly lower costs. This possibly represents one of the most important offsets to rising wage rates, and we see a focus by industry players to lower turnover with programs like Taco Bell's Start With Us, Stay With Us platform. Also, we suggest that the industry should consider the impact of all the past optimization strategies that may have increased automation and efficiency, but at the expense of allowing staff to excel at what makes us human, innovation and creativity. And in the end, we may find that employees empowered to develop their creativity may actually be the most productive of all. Chris, we'd like you to have the last word. What can Americans learn from the rest of the world about how to evolve the store-level business model to make higher wages work?
I think that's a very good question. I mean, at another point in my career, I spent a lot of time working in continental Western Europe, and in some of those countries, labor is not abundant and is very expensive. I mean, you're looking at the high 30s for labor costs. So, I mean, kiosks were available, for example, in Western Europe as early as 2010, 2011, and substantial efforts have been put into technology in order to mitigate labor costs and minimize labor liabilities. So, I mean, I think paying good money to retain good employees makes sense, but I do think that more leadership, more thought, more disruption needs to happen on the capital side in order to preserve margins and reduce labor costs. Again, in the near term, that's going to require a little bit more investment on the part of franchisors and franchisees, but I don't think in cost inflation and labor scarcity is going away anytime soon. So looking to Europe, I think, is probably not a bad place to look at present.
Chris, thank you for joining us today. Also, we want to thank our listeners for their time. This concludes our presentation.